In 1771, Moscow was suffocating. The plague decimated the population by the thousands, plunging the city into panic, then chaos. Into this hell voluntarily stepped a young physician, Danilo Samoilovich. A graduate of the Kiev Academy with prior experience in St. Petersburg hospitals and a background in anatomy, he did more than just treat patients. He risked his own life performing autopsies on the deceased, determined to understand the true nature of the disease. He sought knowledge, not comfort. Samoilovich became the first Russian epidemiologist to challenge centuries of prejudice. For this scientific feat, he found himself at the epicenter of the Plague Riot, where a maddened mob, blinded by fear and superstition, was ready to tear him apart. His life hung by a thread. We often imagine scientific discoveries as flashes of brilliant insight occurring in the quiet of a study. This is not the case. True breakthroughs are forged in fire, in struggle, in a deadly battle against ignorance. They demand not only a sharp mind, but also unparalleled courage. This is the story of just such a battle. The 18th century was an era when knowledge about humans and diseases rested on precarious ground. Medicine relied not on empirical experience, but on centuries-old dogmas derived from ancient authorities. Physicians, if they could even be called that, held unwavering faith in texts written a millennium and a half earlier. Diagnoses were made based on the color of urine, the pulse, or the alignment of stars. Treatments involved bloodletting, emetics, and powders made from crushed stones. The primary goal was not to cure, but to adhere to rituals dictated by tradition. Any attempt to understand disease through anatomy or real-world experience was considered heresy and sacrilege. Truth was sought not within the body, but in old books or in the heavens. Surgery was little more than butchery. Open wounds were cauterized with red-hot irons, and boiling oil was poured into them to cleanse damaged tissues. Pus, far from being seen as a sign of infection, was considered a mark of healing. It was even called laudable pus. In reality, this approach was a sure path to agonizing death from sepsis. No one washed their hands before operations. No one understood the microscopic nature of infection. Diseases were perceived as divine punishment or a curse, rather than phenomena that could be studied and understood. Epidemics swept through cities and countries, and society responded only with prayers, fasting, and religious processions. Science, in its modern understanding, was absent, replaced by superstition and blind faith in prejudice. It was a world where fear and ignorance dictated everyone's place, a world where death harvested lives according to its ancient rules, and humanity was powerless to change anything. Yet even in such a world, where death harvested lives according to its ancient rules, and humanity was powerless to change anything, there emerged those who dared to see differently. One of them was Danilo Samoilovich. The son of a rural priest from a small town in the Chernihiv region, he was drawn from a young age to knowledge, seeking to understand the world not through the prism of church dogmas, but through observation. He was not from a noble family, nor did he possess connections that could propel him into academic circles. His path was one of talent, amplified by an insatiable thirst for learning and a fearless approach to the unknown. His journey began at the Kiev Academy, where he received an education considered brilliant for its time, studying not only theology, but also sciences. Next came St. Petersburg and the medico-surgical school. It was there, in the crowded, stifling hospitals of the capital, that he confronted a harsh reality. Every day, a silent yet terrifying drama unfolded before him. Dozens, even hundreds of people died from simple wounds, fevers, and illnesses that seemingly should have been treatable. Yet physicians continued to adhere to rituals. They cauterized wounds, bled patients, administered emetics, and consulted old treatises, while their patients languished and died. Samoilovich witnessed firsthand that the ancient dogmas underpinning their entire medical world saved no one. They merely prolonged agony and hastened death. This was more than just a crisis of faith in the system, it was a personal, painful experience of observing its complete collapse. The young physician could not accept this state of affairs. He saw not only diseases, but also the causes of their spread, their true nature hidden behind a veil of superstition and pseudoscience. He didn't just treat, he observed, he analyzed. He sought answers where others saw only divine will or inevitable fate. It was this experience, gained at sickbeds, in foul-smelling wards, amidst the moans of the dying and the helplessness and indifference of his colleagues, that transformed him from a diligent student into a true researcher. He could no longer rely on the words of others or the authority of the ancients. He had to uncover the truth himself. He knew that to save, one must understand. This aspiration, this intrinsic need for knowledge, led him where no contemporary had dared to tread, into the very heart of the plague-ridden hell of Moscow in 1771. Moscow, 1771. The city was no longer a city, but a vast, silent morgue. Bodies lay in the streets, and groans echoed from homes. Terror reigned, the plague spared no one. It was precisely here, at the epicenter of the catastrophe, that Samoilovich arrived. He wasted no time. His office was not an office at all, but an improvised operating room directly within the hospital. Chaos surrounded him, yet methodically, day after day, he autopsied the bodies of the deceased. He saw what other doctors ignored: black, swollen buboes, tumors from which deadly fluid oozed. He understood this was not merely inflammation, it was the focal point of the disease. His notes and drawings were not just anatomical sketches, they were maps of the plague's hell. He studied the pathways of contagion. He observed how the disease passed from person to person, not through miasmas or bad air, but through touch, clothing, and objects. This marked the first truly scientific understanding of the plague. But understanding was only the beginning. Action was required. Traditional methods of combating the plague, fumigating streets with herbs, reciting prayers, were powerless. They simply didn't work. To make matters worse, resources were dwindling. For instance, supplies of oil used for disinfecting premises were disappearing rapidly. This oil, mixed with herbs, was considered a potent remedy, but Samoilovich already knew its effectiveness was negligible. He witnessed people treated with this disinfectant continue to die. Samoilovich then made a critical decision. He needed a new approach. He resolved to test a hypothesis. If the disease was transmitted through contact, then disinfection needed to be radical, destroying the pathogen on surfaces. He began experimenting with readily available, yet far more aggressive, substances. He mixed solutions of caustic potash and lye, along with strong acids. He saturated fabrics with them, treated surfaces, and fumigated rooms with the vapors of these compounds. It was a risk. The fumes were corrosive and dangerous. But he knew there was no time to lose. The results were immediate and astonishing. In the wards where his new, rigorous disinfection methods were applied, the number of new infections sharply declined. Doctors and orderlies who followed his protocols survived, while those who continued to rely on old rituals and useless herbs continued to fall ill and die. Samoilovich proved that the plague could be stopped, not by prayer or superstition, but by pure, potent chemistry. This was more than just an experiment, it was a declaration. A declaration that science, not faith, possessed the power to conquer death. Samoilovich wasn't merely searching for a cure, he was constructing a new method of inquiry. His genius lay in his ability to see, not just to believe. He trusted his own observations over ancient texts. Every autopsy, every patient examination, every death was a lesson for him. He collected data, sought patterns, and recognized that the plague was not a curse, but a logical process that could be understood and disrupted. He was not afraid to admit mistakes. When traditional fumigation and oil treatments yielded no results, Samoilovich didn't attribute it to fate. He analyzed the situation, understanding that if old methods were useless, then the cause of the disease and its transmission pathways must be different. He didn't just reject dogmas, he replaced them with new verified facts. This was an iterative process: observation, hypothesis, experiment, conclusion, new observation. This is how modern epidemiology was born. Saving lives was not enough for him. He wanted his knowledge to benefit everyone. Unlike many colleagues who kept their discoveries secret or wrote in Latin, Samoilovich published his observations, methods, and conclusions in Russian. He understood that this was the only way to break through the wall of ignorance, the only way to arm other doctors, paramedics, and even ordinary people with effective means of combating the disease. His works became practical guides, accessible to anyone who could read. He didn't just describe, he provided concrete instructions. How to protect oneself, how to treat clothing, how to clean a room. Essentially, he invented not physical tools, but new protocols and technologies for salvation. He developed guidelines for sewing protective clothing, ventilating wards, and disposing of contaminated items. These instructions were simple, clear, and most importantly, effective. They were his weapon against chaos, his answer to helplessness. Samoilovich thought systematically, but acted with precision. He saw the global picture of the epidemic, yet fought it at the level of each ward, each home, each contaminated object. His mind was like a scalpel, dissecting the disease, separating fact from fiction. He was a man who not only knew, but also taught. He didn't just treat, he created a new medical reality. He was a pioneer, forging a path through darkness to the light of knowledge, step by step, at the cost of incredible effort and personal risk. His success was astounding, yet it brought him no recognition. On the contrary, every life saved, every home disinfected, every day without new infections in his wards only intensified the resentment of those clinging to old ways. Professors from Moscow University, doctors from the Medical Collegium, and influential medical officials regarded Samoilovich with barely concealed contempt. His victories were their defeats. He was dismantling their world, built on perceived authority and centuries-old dogmas, a world where truth was sought not on the dissecting table, but in dusty tomes. They could not accept his methods. How could one disinfect with caustic potash? How could one dissect bodies without fearing divine retribution or contagion? In their view, it was sacrilege and dangerous. They accused him of charlatanism, of harming patients with his poisonous fumes. Cries of, "He's poisoning people, his remedies are toxic, he violates the sacred rules of Hippocrates," echoed through hospital corridors and meetings. They demanded his immediate removal from work and the prohibition of his dangerous experiments, deeming them not only useless, but criminal. A litany of accusations was leveled against Samoilovich. His methods were branded barbaric, his scientific observations dismissed as heresy rather than the result of profound analysis, and his breakthroughs attributed merely to chance, not a systematic approach. The chief physician of Moscow, Dr. Shchepin, a man of the old guard, was one of his most fervent adversaries. He viewed Samoilovich as an upstart, a self-taught individual encroaching upon the immutable foundations of medicine. Dr. Shchepin filed denunciations and wrote official reports, demanding intervention from higher authorities. He insisted that Samoilovich was not only failing to treat patients, but also spreading panic and undermining trust in traditional methods, which, in his view, were the only correct and time-tested ones. The situation escalated, placing Samoilovich under direct pressure. His career, and possibly his life, were under threat. However, powerful patrons emerged to support him. The Moscow commander-in-chief, Count Pyotr Saltykov, was a decisive and pragmatic man. He observed that the plague did not recede with prayers, but Samoilovich was achieving tangible results. Saltykov, along with the influential senator Prince Mikhail Volkonsky, listened to the young physician. They were not medical professionals, but statesmen responsible for order in the capital. While they did not grasp the intricacies of his chemistry, they saw one undeniable fact: wherever Samoilovich worked, death receded. For them, it was not a matter of theory, but of the city's survival. These two men became his shield. They dismissed doctors' complaints and ignored their petitions. They gave Samoilovich carte blanche to continue his work, supplying him with necessary resources despite conservative protests. They understood that what was at stake was not the reputation of old doctors, but the lives of thousands of Muscovites. Their support was not merely an act of mercy, it was a strategic decision based on a cold assessment of the facts. They bet on science and proven results, rather than blind faith. This support allowed Samoilovich to persevere. He did not deviate from his path, nor did he cease his autopsies or abandon his caustic solutions. He continued to save lives, proving the validity of his methods with each passing day and every new survivor. Yet the conflict did not subside. It merely entered a hidden phase, smoldering beneath the surface, ready to erupt at any moment. Danilo Samoilovich found himself at the epicenter not only of the plague, but also of a battle for the future of medicine. He stood alone against an army of prejudices, protected only by the faith of a few enlightened individuals in the power of knowledge and the undeniable results of his work. The simmering conflict finally erupted not within the hospital walls, but on the streets of Moscow. Public sentiment was boiling. People were exhausted by the plague, the authorities' inaction, and useless prayers. In September 1771, the spark of ignorance ignited a powder keg of fear. Archbishop Ambrosius, attempting to stop the crowds flocking to a miraculous icon, removed it. This proved to be the final straw. A furious mob stormed the Kremlin, then the Chudov Monastery. Ambrosius was found and brutally murdered. Moscow plunged into chaos. This was more than just a riot. It was a blind, primal terror directed against anything that seemed incomprehensible, alien, or threatening. Doctors, especially those who dissected the dead, became primary targets. Danilo Samoilovich found himself in the very inferno of this plague riot. His hospital, his wards, his life, everything hung by a thread. The mob, incited by rumors of poisonous disinfectants and sacrilegious autopsies, surged toward the buildings where medical professionals worked. They were accused of every mortal sin, spreading infection, poisoning the air, conspiring with evil forces. Samoilovich did not flee. He attempted to speak with the people, to explain. But his words failed to reach ears maddened by fear. His scientific arguments were drowned out by the roar of the crowd. He saw their eyes, filled with hatred, despair, and a blind belief in the wildest superstitions. This was not a battle of wits, but a clash with the ancient, shapeless monster of ignorance. Only at the last moment, when his life was truly imperiled, was Samoilovich forced to hide. He was saved only by a miracle and the loyalty of a few colleagues. The riot was suppressed by troops. The streets of Moscow were once again filled not only with those dead from the plague, but also with victims of the unrest. The city was on the brink of complete collapse. It was precisely at this moment, when all old methods of combating the disease had proven useless and old authorities had lost all credibility, that Samoilovich, having survived this hell, gained new, undeniable stature. His work, his methods, his unparalleled courage, all had withstood the most terrible test. He not only survived at the epicenter of the plague, but also passed through the fire of popular wrath. Governor-General Saltykov and Prince Volkonsky, his patrons, saw this not as coincidence, but as proof of his exceptionalism. His methods, once considered dangerous experiments before the riot, were now perceived as the only salvation. His poison, caustic potash, proved not to be a poison, but a weapon against death. His sacrilegious autopsies became the sole path to understanding the disease. After the suppression of the riot, with the city facing the threat of complete annihilation, Samoilovich was granted virtually unlimited authority. He became not merely a physician, but the chief strategist in the war against the plague. His word became law. He directed citywide disinfection efforts, organized the isolation of the sick, and established new quarantine stations. His protocols, his instructions, and his insistence on using chemistry rather than prayers became the cornerstone for Moscow's salvation. This was a turning point. Samoilovich, who just yesterday was an outcast accused of charlatanism and heresy, now stood at the forefront of the fight. His authority was no longer disputed, not because he won a verbal duel or earned an academic degree, but because he had passed through fire and plague, and his methods yielded results. He was not merely a theoretician, but a practitioner who proved his rectitude at the cost of his own life and the lives of those he saved. His victory was not over his opponents, but over ignorance embodied in the rioting mob and the rigid minds of his colleagues. He became a symbol of new medicine, born not in the quiet of studies, but in the crucible of catastrophe. Following the suppression of the riot, with the city on the brink of annihilation, Samoilovich was given carte blanche. His protocols, once deemed heretical, became the new standard. He immediately set about restructuring the entire system for combating the epidemic. First and foremost, disinfection methods changed. Instead of useless herbs and oils that merely fumigated infected premises, solutions of caustic potash and lye, along with strong acids, were now employed. These tissue-corroding chemicals were used to treat all surfaces in homes where sick individuals had been. Doors, floors, furniture, everything was washed with these compounds. The clothing of the deceased and the recovering was not merely aired out, it was boiled, washed in caustic solutions, or burned. Samoilovich introduced strict control over isolation. The sick were no longer left to die in their homes, where they became sources of infection for family and neighbors. They were forcibly sent to specially established hospitals and quarantine centers, where they received care, and crucially, the chain of infection transmission was broken. For those who had contact with the sick, strict quarantine periods were imposed, 40 days of isolation, even if the person felt well. This measure allowed for the identification of hidden carriers and the prevention of new outbreaks. Doctors and paramedics working under Samoilovich's direction began to universally apply the methods he developed, wearing protective clothing, thoroughly washing hands after each contact, and ventilating wards. These simple yet revolutionary rules for that era drastically reduced infections among medical personnel. While previously mortality among doctors and orderlies was nearly 100%, it now decreased by tenfold. The results were swift. Within weeks of the new protocols being implemented, the mortality curve in Moscow began to plummet. Thousands of lives were saved. Where hundreds had died daily, now only dozens, then single digits, perished. The city, recently gripped by panic and chaos, gradually returned to life. Plague buboes were no longer a death sentence. While previously only a few survived, now, thanks to early isolation and proper care, the chances of recovery significantly increased. This was not merely a decline in the epidemic, it was the first proof in Russian history that disease could be defeated not by prayer, but by a scientific approach based on observation, experimentation, and decisive action. Samoilovich did not just heal the city, he laid the foundation for future victories over epidemics. Danilo Samoilovich did more than just stop the plague in Moscow. He snatched victory from the clutches of blind fear and centuries of prejudice. His story is not one of brilliant insight in the quiet of a study. It is a drama that unfolded amidst the groans of the dying and the cries of a rioting mob. The paradox of his greatness lies in the fact that the world changed not because his methods were acknowledged, but because he proved their effectiveness at the cost of his own life. He was rejected, ridiculed, and nearly killed. Yet it was he, not the scholarly men of his time, who laid the foundation for modern medicine. His legacy is an enduring reminder: true progress is born in struggle, and knowledge based on observation and facts is always stronger than the most ancient dogmas. He was not just a physician, he was a pioneer, forging a path toward light in an era of absolute darkness.